This video contains a small breakdown of some of the biggest changes in Angular version 5. On November 1, 2017, the core team released version 5 of Angular. This is a major release containing new features and bug fixes. This release continues the focus on making Angular smaller, faster, and easier to use. First, we'll have a look at the improvements in this release. These are the activation of the build optimizer, some compiler and zone improvements to save time and reduce the size of your bundles, and finally the use of RXJS in version 5.5. There is also a bunch of new or extended features like the Angular Universal State Transfer API, re-implemented pipes for number, date, and currencies, the new HTTP client, extended options for Angular forms, and new router lifecycle events. We'll take a look at each of this. Let's get an overview about the improvements. First, we take a look at the build optimizer. The build optimizer is a tool included in our CLI for making your bundle smaller using our semantic understanding of your Angular application. The build optimizer has two primary jobs. First, we are able to mark parts of your application as pure. This improves the tree shaking provided by the existing tools, removing additional parts of your application that aren't needed. The second thing the build optimizer does is to remove Angular decorators from your application's runtime code. Decorators are used by the compiler and aren't needed at runtime and can be removed. Each of these jobs decrease the size of your JavaScript bundles and increase the boot speed of your application for your users. There is also a big impact through some compiler improvements that moved into this release. First improvement, TypeScript transforms. Under the hood, the Angular compiler now operates as a TypeScript transform, making incremental rebuilds dramatically faster. TypeScript transforms were a new feature introduced as part of TypeScript 2.3 that allows us to hook into the standard TypeScript compilation pipeline. You can take advantage of this by running ngserve with the AOT flag turned on. This will become the default in a future release of the CLI. When performing an incremental AOT build of Angular.io, the new compiler pipeline saves 95% of the build time. The next compiler improvement is called Preserve Whitespace. Historically, tabs, new lines, and spaces in your templates have been faithfully recreated and included in your build by the compiler. You can now choose whether or not to preserve whitespace coming from your components and your application. You can specify this as part of each component's decorator. The default value is false. Or you can specify it application-wide in your tsconfig.json, where it also currently defaults to true. In general, the component-level specifications override application-wide specifications. RxJS 5.5. This recent release of RxJS fully empowers developers to avoid the side effects of the previous import mechanism with a new way of using RxJS called lettable operators. These new operators eliminate the side effects and the code splitting and tree shaking problems that existed with the previous patch method of importing operators. This is an example of an observable that uses the old version of RxJS. Here you needed to import the module and run the module's global scope. You can now import multiple exports from the operators module and combine them with the pipe method. I recommend to change this in your whole codebase. This will potentially result in much smaller bundles. Zone speed improvements. We've made zones faster by default, and we've made it possible to bypass zones entirely for performance-focused applications. Word. Nothing more to add here. Just an example how to activate the bypass for zones. As you see, it's really simple. Let's get an overview about the features. Angular Universal State Transfer API. You can now more easily share application state between the server-side and client-side versions of your application. Angular Universal is a project focused on helping developers to perform server-side rendering of Angular applications. By rendering your Angular applications on the server and then bootstrapping on top of the generated HTML, you can add support for scrapers and crawlers that don't support JavaScript, and you can increase the perceived performance of your application. Internationalized number, date, and currency pipes. In Angular we have relied on the browser to provide number, date, and currency formatting using browser internationalization APIs. This resulted in a need for a polyfill for most developers, meant that users were seeing inconsistent results across browsers, and we received comments that common formats, such as the currency pipe, didn't match developer expectations out of the box. In 5.0 we've updated the pipes to use our own implementation. The HTTP client. It's a smaller, easier, and more powerful way to make web requests in Angular. The new HTTP client has gotten some great praise from developers, so we're now recommending the HTTP client for all applications, and deprecating the previous Angular HTTP service. With the old HTTP module, you needed to transform every request to JSON by your own. With the new HTTP client, JSON is now the default response. You also able to use the generic get function to define the structure of your response. Angular Forms adds update on for Blur and Submit. You can now run validation and value updates on Blur, or on Submit, instead of on every input event. Forms are a very important part of many applications, and if you have any sort of server-side validation, or any heavier processes triggered by validation or value changes that you want to run less often, you can now take control of the validation and value change timing at the control level, or specify it for an entire form. To use this feature at your template-driven forms, just use the ng model options with update on Blur. Or you enable the update on option for the whole form via an ng form options. To use this feature at your reactive forms, just add an update on property to your form group or form control. The new router lifecycle events. We've added new lifecycle events to the router, allowing developers to track the cycle of the router from the start of running guards through to completion of activation. These events could be used for things such as showing a spinner on a specific router outlet when a child is updating, or to measure performance of guards and or resolvers. The new events and sequence are guards check start, child activation start, guards check end, resolve start, resolve end, activation end, child activation end. An example of using these events to start/stop a spinner might look like this. It's really easy and readable. Thanks for watching. Please give us feedback to improve this video and other useful resources we provide.